I'm at the LSE Africa Summit. Before I introduce the chair for the next panel, and if you happen to have just arrived in this long break, I'm Agatha May Akora. I'm one of the co-directors for the LSE Africa Summit, and I'm the host for today. Please remember to tweet, post on LinkedIn, post on Instagram. We have 2 hashtags going, hashtag LSE Africa Summit 2023 and hashtag the Now and Next Generation, which is our theme. So we do want to see your live tweets and we want to engage with you on social media. So please remember to do that. So I will now pass over to the chair for the next panel. So that will be discussing, should Africa be optimistic about COP27? And our chair will be Martin Brown Muene, who is a PhD candidate in environmental policy and development here at the LSE. So let's give him a warm welcome as he comes to the stage.
Right. Thank you, Agatha, for that warm introduction. Hello, everyone, here in this room and those that are joining us from online. So, as you've heard, my name is Martin, and I'll be the chair for this session. And with me, I have 3 distinguished African professionals and leaders to help me. Now, but as we meet today, we meet on the heels of the tropical cyclone Freddy, which lasted for over a month, leaving 400 people dead and thousands of homes destroyed in various parts of the eastern and southern Africa. Many dreams and livelihoods were destroyed. Now, even as we speak now, the Horn of Africa is experiencing one of the worst droughts on record. And with that, tens of millions of people have been exposed to starvation, livelihoods destroyed, dreams affected or injured. But even as we do so, it isn't long before since the COP27 sat in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. It was barely 4 months ago. And it was called the Africa's COP because it was hoped that it would address the challenges of Africa. But did it? Should we be optimistic about the outcomes of COP27? That is the big question that we are exploring in this panel. Now, for those that followed this COP27, you might realize that, or you might have seen the sheer presence and power of the fossil fuel, perhaps more strongly than ever before. And as a result, there were several missed opportunities, but let's not talk about that. That's a story for another day. Instead, we'll focus on the bright side of the COP27. And instead, we'll talk about one of them, that is the Loss and Damage Fund, which was established in that COP27 and held as a historic moment, and also stands out as one of the most important decisions in the climate change negotiations since 2015, when the Paris Agreement was adopted. Now, it took us about 8 years and 6 tries to have another historic moment. I do hope that we are not going to wait for another 8 years or so before we have another historic moment. So this summit offers us an opportunity to reflect on the outcomes of COP27, but with a focus on those decisions or outcomes that are relevant for Africa. So, should we be optimistic about COP27? This is the big question we are exploring, and we have 3, as I have said, distinguished Africans, professionals, leaders who will help us explore this question in form of a panel discussion. 2 of them are here in person, and one of them, Dr. Richard Munang, is graciously following from Nairobi. I hope you are in Nairobi and not somewhere else. That's the assumption.
Actually, yes, I am in Nairobi.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. So I will introduce the panel and I'll kindly ask them to join us here as I do that. And I'm not going, it's in no particular order, except that which I have on the program. Okay? So first, I'll start with Richard, online panelists. Richard Munang is a Deputy Regional Director of the Africa Office of the UN Environment, or the UN Environment Program, as we have known it for a long time. Before this appointment, he served as a climate change coordinator in the same office, where he guided the implementation of UNEP's climate resilient development strategy at national and regional levels. He has quite extensive programming and policy implementation experience, and if you have followed him on LinkedIn, you have seen how active he is and how passionate he is about the young people of Africa. So we are very pleased to have you here, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
The next person is the panelist is Chinelo Anohu, who is the Senior Director of the Africa Investment Forum. So Chinelo, if you kindly can join us here. Thank you. I'm very excited, ladies and gentlemen, as you can tell. Chinelo runs you have the choice to make. Good. So Chinelo runs the Africa Investment Forum, the preeminent investment platform on the continent of Africa. It's a flagship initiative of the African Development Bank in concert with key founding partners. The AIF is charged with enhancing the quality of deals, raising capital and accelerating financial closure of impactful transactions in critical sectors of Africa. And prior to joining AFDB, Chinelo served as the Director General of Nigeria's National Pension Commission, or PENCOM, where she played a pivotal role in reforming the pension system and mobilizing domestic resources with the introduction of the contributory pension scheme. The last but not the least, we have Dr. Tobi Elusakin. Tobi, a round of applause, please. Tobi is a sustainability consultant at Mace Group and a project manager with more than almost a decade experience in delivering strategy, climate, environmental management programs in the public and private sector. He works across different facets of sustainability, from energy production and efficiency to climate justice and environmental impact. So we are very thrilled to have you here. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the plan is to have a discussion with these distinguished panelists, and then as you follow, you might have some questions, note them down. We will have a session where we will take those questions towards the end of this. So are you excited for this? Yeah. Fantastic, let's do this then. Okay, I think I will, yeah, all right. So, what will happen is I'll first start in the same order that I introduced you, to take a minute or so to address this audience that are here and those that are online. Just briefly, something about you, something about your work, 1 minute, and then we will crack on and answer some of the questions that we have. Thank you. Maybe you'll start with Dr. Richard.
Yeah, thank you very much again for this great discussion today. And I mean, I'm here, first of all, to contribute ideas, and at the same time also hear what colleagues have in mind. And being the Deputy Regional Director for UN Environment Program in Africa, our focus pretty much center around 3 areas, which is addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, of pollution and waste and biodiversity loss. But among all these, climate change is wired across all those challenges. And those who are actually at the forefront to be able to address these are young people. And there is absolutely no way that you can be able to address challenges without tapping into your strength. And Africa's strength is her youth. But more so a youth not just to be mentioned as dividend when we have not actually invested in them, but a youth in which their skills can be revamped to turn those environmental challenges into opportunities. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. And then...
Well, thank you very much. I'm Chinelo Anohu, and I run the Africa Investment Forum, which I'm looking forward to telling you a lot about later on. It's the flagship initiative of the African Development Bank, set up with 7 other founding partners, Africa 50, AfrExim, and others, with the sole aim of assisting greatly in project preparation and also raising capital, and then very crucially, accelerating the rate of financial closure of deals on the continent. And by this, we focus very clearly on the project sponsors, many budding that I see in this room now with the innovative ideas, and ensure that those ideas are turned into bankable projects so that they can attract the capital that is so very present on the continent. So we're discussing a lot today, but my focus would be to distill whatever discussions we're having today to practicality, transactions. Thank you.
Right, fantastic.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I'm a sustainability consultant working primarily in the UK within the built environment, but also branching out to a number of other sectors. Mine really is a significant amount of interest really in policy and policy development within Africa, within the continent, in relation to looking at how we can get some of these deals and financing into the environment, into infrastructure within Africa, and basically how we can reduce the cost of finance for different infrastructure projects within Africa. So good to be here.
Fantastic. So thank you. To start us off, perhaps, Dr. Richard, you've talked about. I'll keep coming back to you. I don't know how to. Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah. You're somewhere. So help us, Dr. Richard. You are within a very critical institution that has served the environmental community and the climate change fraternity for a long time. So to help us to sort of reflect on the importance of the loss and damage idea and the progress that we have made up to now, including in the COP27.
Yeah, thanks again, Martin. I think before we get to that, let's put things in perspective. We are in a continent today that is termed a young continent. Of course it is. And over 70% of the population is below the age of 30, and over 60% of the population is below the age of 25, and the median age is 20. When you put this trend in perspective with how you started off with your opening remarks with Cyclone Freddy that have actually cost over 400 lives and displaced over 80,000 households, that then means that there is a big issue. It means there is already loss and damage issue happening. And in 2022, research was done that shows that 55 countries actually have suffered loss and damage, costing up to about $532 billion US, of which 22 of those countries are in the African continent. And those countries could have been 20% more richer, more wealthier, if not of loss and damage. But then with the COP27, where after 30 years of loss and damage being on the front burner, the decision to establish a loss and damage fund actually was exciting and it was necessary. Far a little bit took long, but very, very necessary. But this is the point that I want to really put in perspective here, which is that if you look at the losses, 55 countries, 22 of them in the African continent, $532 billion US already suffered, 20% less wealthier, and the pledges that were actually put forward, less than 200 million, those are peanuts. But when you juxtapose this within historical lens, then you will notice that in 2009, there was the 100 billion pledge to be able to build resilience of developing countries. But up till today, only 80 billion have actually come through, and only 20% of that 80 billion have come to the African continent, which is equivalent to about 0.6% of the needs of Africa to implement their climate actions of 3 trillion that is needed. Good news that loss and damage fund is going to be created, but at the same time, we must be able to learn lessons and therefore cannot only capitalize on it because every day life is lost and one life lost is far too many. And so we need to innovate. And I think the discussion today should really be, what should we do now? Not only waiting for a fund to be created as lives have been lost.
Thank you very much, Richard, for putting that into perspective. Indeed, we are excited to hear that the fund has been established, but you are putting us some questions that is this something that we should be hopeful, or what do we need to do to ensure that we don't lose like we have lost, in my words, before. We've made pledges of hundreds of billions, but so far, as you've mentioned, those ones haven't been paid. Chinelo, is this, the question then becomes, why haven't we? Why don't we have, why haven't we had monies contributed into, into the kitties that have been agreed on before? And is the loss and damage fund going to be one of those?
One of those, you mean one of those
and
that you talk
promises,
about,
one of
and then
those
nothing happens, right?
Yes.
Well, I think it's up to us, all of us in this room, to determine that. And you said something very critical. There's a lot of promises made. There's a lot of funding available. Why aren't we seeing it? It goes back to the first point I started, why the Africa Investment Forum was started, project preparation. When you say project preparation, it means taking that project and making it attractive to the kind of funding you need. I'll give an example in my former life, the pension industry. And there was a lot of pressure at the time to ensure that the pension funds were channeled into setting projects which were ready, bankable, but totally unsuitable for the pension industry. The regulations were clear. Because of the fiduciary nature of pension funds, institutional funds, they couldn't get into so many other different things. So when you have a pipeline of 20 of those projects waiting to tap into the pension fund, it's never going to happen, because no serious regulator will allow pension funds to get into the green field and all of that. But what happens? This is where a place like the AIF comes in, the Africa Investment Forum. The private sector can. The private equity can get into those investments. Those projects, the venture capitalists can, but they will not stay. They would exit in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, doesn't matter, max. But then the pension funds will be ready and waiting. So that's the platform we have created on the Africa Investment Forum, to take these deals and not just waiting and knocking on a door that's never going to open because the rules guarding that door prevent it from opening for that particular kind of investment. And that is the innovation. I think it was Dr. Richard did mention that. We have to be innovative. We have to make the funds available work for our projects. And that's the structuring that is necessary. And we need to focus on that.
Okay, so financing has its rules, and are those rules made to make it difficult for the young people of Africa and organizations or startups led by women to access funds?
Not necessarily. It's not so much as being made to be difficult. It's made to protect whatever the investments. I just gave you an example of the pension funds. We're never going to advocate a bending of those rules, because at the end of the day, it was our job to keep the pension fund sacrosanct for the owners of the fund when they're old and no longer able to work. You couldn't tell them stories, and they didn't have the longevity to wait for it to rebound. However,
Yes.
it is also necessary that we put the things on the table that will deal with the present day needs of the young people. And this is what I say, that our focus is on the project sponsors, the deal owners, those that come with bright, innovative ideas, transformational ideas, but we work with them. And it's all about the blending of the financing, blending of different kinds of investors. We have the family businesses that are largely ignored when you're talking about, but there's a lot of money in there.
Okay.
How do we channel it to these projects?
Right.
So it's not about making it difficult for young people, it's finding what works for the young people.
Amazing. I'll come back to you to ask whether then we can count on the private sector, given that things like loss and damage and adaptation don't offer really immediate benefits or immediate financial returns. And I'll come back to you, Tobi, in that regard. You see, we have been talking about, and what Chinelo is talking about generally is projects that are bankable, and most of these are seen in the light of sustainability projects or the so-called net zero now. And you are aware of our zero mission or mission zero in the UK. So how is the net zero really good for Africa? And should Africa be sucked into this kind of thinking?
I would say, just simply answering the question, net zero is definitely good for Africa. And I don't think it's a question of Africa being sucked into that type of thinking, but really Africa trying to lead from that perspective. Net zero in itself and achieving net zero emissions really helps with mitigation of impacts of climate change. We just talked about the cyclone that killed over 400 people. Last year, I think there was wildfires in Algeria, flooding in South Africa. There's several impacts of climate change that are impacting most vulnerable communities within Africa, and being able to achieve net zero emissions really helps to mitigate the impacts of climate change disasters, especially affecting those vulnerable communities. So just to answer that question, really, net zero is quite important for Africa, and yeah, it's important that we lead in terms of that thinking.
Okay, so yes, I'll follow up a little bit on that, Tobi. There has been an argument, and this argument has been made everywhere people have sat to talk about climate change, that Africa is being told to focus on stopping emissions when she hasn't emitted any yet. And those that have emitted already, it has come to a point where now the impacts of that are being felt. And they emitted to develop to become where they are, and now they have even the money to give us to adapt to the impacts of what what they did from 1850s or whatever. And I'll ask you this again, picking back to what Chinelo has said, that the things that matter, that are urgent for Africa. Africa has already said, our focus is adaptation. We want this because people are dying. What use is a solar panel on somebody's whose house has been submerged in water, or a herbal toothpaste for somebody who is hungry? The millions of whom are in Africa. Thank you.
It's a fair criticism of that thought process. I think it's important to first of all look at to think about it. First of all, looking at food and shelter, before you start to think about actual mitigation or adaptation against climate change impacts. For me, I really do think that the first thing to start to do is really to try to bring ourselves out of the impacts of these climate change related disasters, and before we really start to look at development in relation to, for example, low carbon technology and things like solar panels, wind turbines, things like that. For me, that's really important.
Great, thank you. And so in all these, then we have to have institutions and leadership that really comes forward and says, this is what Africa needs, these are the needs of Africa, and if we had to go net zero, these are some of the emerging or urgent needs that we have to take care of. But Richard, we do have institutions that, like yours, that are there to help us address some of these challenges. Now, tell me, what is your evaluation of the global leadership, especially on the climate change resilience front? And are African institutions really and leadership equal to the formidable task of on these very salient issues?
Yeah, thanks again, Martin. Now let me build on what Chinelo and Dr. Tobi have already said. If you tell a hungry child that you gave him or her food yesterday, that means nothing to that child. A hungry kid since morning today will not listen to what climate change is all about. We will not listen to the jargon of loss and damage or to the jargon of temperatures rising, or not the one to put food on the table. And when we get down to communities, our mothers want to put food on the table and money in their pockets. That's what matters. And when you juxtapose this within the reality of the continent today, Africa is a leader when it comes to climate change policy. There is absolutely no continent in the entire world as we speak today that have actually ratified the Paris Agreement as fast as the African continent, that actually submitted the NDCs, the first NDCs. 98% of the entire African continent, 52 out of 54 countries did. And when it came to revise climate action plans, as we're speaking today, 48 countries have done so, higher than any other continent in the world. So when it comes to climate policy, Africa do understand the inherent opportunities, but the mismatch comes when we talk policy versus implementation. And globally, when you look at the trends of leadership when it comes to environmental and climate issue, it's been quite very clear. 50 years ago in 1972, the United Nations Environment Conference, culminating in the formulation of the United Nations Environment Programme, to IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to produce reports which last week actually show we're warming at 1.1 degree, to the UNFCCC, what is called the Rio Convention, to the United Nations Convention on Desertification and Convention on Biological Diversity, to Kyoto Protocol and to the Paris Agreement. That's global leadership. The question then becomes, are these the leadership that is being shown and the policies that are put in place being translated at the same rate that is needed to match up with the changing climate? The answer is not yet. But we need then to appreciate that as a continent, there have been progress in policy. But now, how do we then move now from policy to implementation? I think Chinelo, and I would just want to build there with what Dr. Tobi and Chinelo said. If you look at the continent today, there's no absence of policies. There's no absence of ideas. What have been the biggest missing link is absence of incentives. It's been absence of an implementation, and at the same time, also absence of ensuring that at least we can be able to galvanize people from all stratas in the continent. And let's not forget that 80% of the entire African continent is in the informal sector. And when you look at the financial resources that we talk most of the time, we keep forgetting this 80%, which I call the bottom of the continent, because Africa is an informal continent. And any discussion without bringing them on board will not be able to take us forward. And therefore, the policies already in place need to be turned into investment plans that target those in the informal sector, because our youth are in the informal sector. Our mothers and brothers and sisters are in the informal sector. They suffer the brunt of climate change more than any other person. And we must leverage the structures that are accessible to them. Communal cooperatives. When we discuss finance, we don't even hear about our chamas in East Africa, or the Njangis and Tongdings in Central Africa, and other having different names across the continent. That must become the turbocharger of not only channeling resources, but institutions we can use to make sure that at least we can channel the climate action solutions through them. And lastly, I want to touch on a point that Dr. Tobi did mention, which is, and you also mentioned, Martin, which is that Africa's priority is adaptation. I think we need to be very careful with the narrative. There is a problem with the narrative. Yes, adaptation is a priority for Africa because Africa is suffering the brunt of climate change more than any other continent and warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. But it doesn't mean that Africa cannot leverage mitigation to drive adaptation. A mother in a community in northern Kenya, in Turkana, who is suffering because she grows a vegetable and cannot add value, needs a solar dryer. That's a mitigation action that can then dry that vegetable or dry her maize and corn, and she will then be able to preserve it. She can then be able to preserve it either using that solar dryer or add value to it, or at the same time use solar power irrigation to irrigate her farm. That's a mitigation action. So using mitigation to power adaptation is the kind of narrative that Africa needs today.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Richard. And that's already happening. I think some of the African countries are leaders in this. For instance, Kenya now gets 90% of its energy from renewable sources. You tell me if that's not climate leadership in mitigation, then I don't know what that is. Chinelo, tell us then, the institutions that Richard is talking about, the institutions that are supposed to lead us into accessing these resources that are out there. the institutions that should be helping us to create these policies or mechanisms that help us to access what you like to call blended financing. Are they doing a good job, or what should we, sitting down here, what should we do to ensure that then actually those institutions respond to the needs that we already know, rather than going out in these conferences and describing our problems? Because we know our problems, we don't need them described, we can describe them. But what leadership is required is to provide the solutions. Are our institutions doing that? And you can cite some of the things you are doing at AIF as you reflect on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just need to be very specific because our institutions, I want to focus on the African Development Bank, which is, and setting up the AIF, the African Investment Forum, was a direct response to the things you've talked about right now, to practicalize this disbursement of funds, this provision that we have. Because yes, they announced that we have $500 million fund for this, and then 2 years down the line, there's no access. Because very few projects meet the criteria required, and those criteria are necessary. It's not going to be thrown away. So a platform like the AIF now takes that present allocation, brings round the projects, and we sit down. It's a very intense work, one-on-one engagement with what we call the project sponsors. Those are the people that come with deals requiring financing, because the funds are not going to be given to your bank account, it goes into projects. Why are you not able to access the fund available, that has the intervention that has been made available? You have not met this criteria, and sometimes it's just pure undiluted corporate governance and the lack of it. Keeping your books together, understanding that there are things that are to be done and not to be done. Before we take on a project, we do the KYCs on those projects. Who are the owners? What do you do? Do you mingle your bank accounts? Do you keep appropriate books? Some of this information is lacking because of the plethora of ideas that is residing on the continent. We fail to bring in the other part, that we turn those ideas into bankable projects. And that's the big problem, project preparation. And when you say, oh, there had loads of projects ready, what we've seen, and I'm talking from experience, is that when someone comes to me and says the project is ready, sometimes I need only about 30 minutes with the person to show them why these projects are not ready, and why the money you're looking for from the African Development Bank will not be able to come at this stage. It will come 2 years down the line. But I don't say, sorry, we can't help you. I say, come, I'll take you to where you get it from. And this is where, and I liked what Dr. Richard said about the huge sources of domestic resources that exist on the continent. What we do is to mop up those resources and ensure that we create a platform where there's just not one player. There's just not one, it's not just the DFIs. We have the private sector playing a critical role in mobilizing investments on the continent. And we have raised since the inception of the African Investment Forum over 100 billion worth of investment interests. And now we pursue those interests in terms of their due diligence to ensure that those funds move into the projects. We sit back a lot on the continent, and all of us are guilty of this, expecting things to be done for us. And I think that as soon as the focus shifts of what we can do for ourselves, how we can improve ourselves, and how we're not looking for a lower standard for us, instead rise to meet the globally accepted standard, Africa will be unstoppable.
Okay. So that makes me wonder then, because I do agree. You can't just be throwing money away just like that. If you tell us the money is there, but we can't access it because of the stringent criteria, that really doesn't help much, right? So is it the criteria that are too stringent, or is it the capacity that is not there? And what do we need to ensure that then we bring those together?
Sorry, I just need to ask us to be extremely careful in saying it's too stringent. Says who?
Because we can't access it.
No, but why can you not? Because you haven't met the criteria. Why can't you meet the criteria? That's what I need you to understand. It's about mindset. You have I'm using you for an example.
Okay.
Some people in this room would not even think it's worth their while to do a master's degree. Do you know the amount of brains we have? Why can't you meet it? This is my point. Who says it's too stringent? I'm looking round at this room. These are first-class brains. It may take a little longer, but it's not impossible. And I want us to understand that everything is about the mindset. If you say it's too stringent, you will meet it. If you say, I'm going to overcome it, I'm not, yes, we might ask for a little leeway, but I'm not a fan of lowering standards for anybody or anything. Rise to meet it, and you can. And when you say things are too stringent, it's probably because you haven't prepared enough.
Okay.
It's probably because you haven't started enough. It's probably because you haven't gathered the resources within you to meet those criteria. And in addition, it's also probably because you're looking to get funding where you should not be looking, given the stage of your project.
So two things you've pointed out here, not understanding, the fit of the projects and the financing we are looking at, and the capacity they need to match, and that's what AIF does. So I think that's important. And the other is the capacity really to sort of demonstrate that you have met the criteria, or to understand the criteria in the first place, so that you can meet them. Dr. Tobi, I know this, there has been an argument that we have, part of the reason as to why we are where we are now is the mentality and the mindset of putting profits above the planet and the people. And that is why we are where we are. And some people have argued, notably, I might be one of those people, but it's not me.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
that when you are in a crisis, when we are in a crisis, mindset can help, but then we need to ask ourselves, why are we in this particular crisis? And the loss and damage, I think what Dr. Richards talked about, is a glaring example of where we keep pumping fuel into the fire and asking people to learn how to sort of dive or use the fire extinguishers and so on and so forth. How often do you see this mentality of profits over people and the planet play out in the projects that you work on? And the fact that most of those projects, as Chinelo is saying, one of the criteria, I think, is that it must demonstrate return on investment, for instance. So you say that we do need return on investment, but sustainability really adduces to the people, it adduces future benefits of protecting our earth and keeping it safe. So tell us, what do you see in the field?
Honestly, to the question of how often, I would say working as a sustainability consultant on a daily basis. Really, my work essentially involves trying to convince a lot of large corporate organizations to try to take the focus away a little bit from profit and look more at the focus on people and the planet. So just to answer that question, yeah, I would say it happens on a regular basis. In terms of, I think, trying to move forward in looking more at people and profit, I would say it would be important to look more at, like you mentioned, you mentioned mindset, and then also educating yourselves really as to how you would really be able to marry those three factors. So marrying profit, planet, and people, and not just looking at it as an either or. Yeah, not just looking at it as an either or, but how you can marry those three from project perspective. And the litany of projects that really have done that. Some of them within the African continent, but others like outside of it. And I would not be necessarily in the best place to really enumerate some of those examples, but they are there. And I would say, just from the little bit of research I've done, I would say that in terms of looking more at education and developing that mindset, we have a number of trailblazing countries in Africa that have started to do that. So, we've got South Africa, Nigeria that have tried to develop energy transition plans, which I believe they took to COP27 to actually try to drum up some interest in investments for. So these are things where, for example, with the Nigeria energy transition plan, you've tried to identify, each of the different sectors, what we need, how much we actually need, and I think what we need to do further from that is really to help to educate Africans, the entire population, as to what is actually needed, what is the gap between where we are and where we want to get to, from the marrying of those three different phases together, and then how can we actually bridge
Okay,
that
okay. How successful are you in trying to move this mindset from?
gap? Not very. I would
No.
I would admit, but we keep fighting the good fight. Yeah, I would
Okay.
say, but it's I'm in a job, so
Yeah.
I say we do try to get change those hearts and minds.
That's good. That's
Yeah.
good. So then I'll go back this way now, Dr. Richard. So you'll have to wait a little bit. Then having that mindset we have seen there, it's becoming very difficult. Should we or can Africa count on the private sector who have that mindset to get the resources that we are required? I know I'm going back, but I would like to marry that question. Can we trust the private sector to help? Because the reason I ask this is, as you mentioned earlier, there has been a lot of money available for carbon reduction, net zero, and that. But from where I sit, much of the research I have done, much of the work I have, you come and talk about adaptation and you will not interest the private sector unless you can demonstrate to them that there is a lot to be earned from adaptation. But there are not very many opportunities I know that can make profit from the loss and damage. Maybe I need to be educated on that. Can we trust the private sector to mobilize those funds for loss and damage?
But of course, and I think Tobi hit it right on the head when you said you can't do either or. I'm not interested in projects that don't have return on investments, full stop. You have to earn money. You have to make money. We can't all be charitable. And that is a key part of the private sector, that drive for a return on investment. Part of what we tell the investors on our platform is to show them a clear path of the return on their investments. Otherwise, they will not be interested. That's full stop.
Okay.
But now, in that path, can you also affect the environment positively? Yes.
Okay.
Part of the criteria for you even to bring your project on the Africa Investment Forum platform is to demonstrate the impact that it will make. And the larger impact that it does, the higher you score, because obviously we cannot take on all the projects that want to be taken on. So I don't want a situation where we're looking at an either-or situation. Oh, how does it impact? What does it do for the public? What is the social benefit? Do we have all the ESG factors inside? It can make money. It has to make money. And if we don't look at that path where it becomes a situation where people are not interested in getting into it. Because the private sector establishment has bills to pay, has salaries to pay. And those salaries are also trickling down into homes, into education, into everything. So yes, the role the private sector has to play is huge. But I don't think any one group can play those roles in isolation.
Okay.
You have the DFIs. Those are the ones that do developmental finance. They're not so big on return on investment, but then they take forever.
Yeah, to materialize.
It takes a lot. When you're driven by profit, the considerations are different. You don't have 2 years, you don't have 5 years, you don't have things to consider, oh, we'll work on it, we'll do this. No.
Okay.
If you're driven by profit, it has to end at a particular time, give you the returns you're looking at. And these are the criteria we put in these projects to make sure that it has that so that the private sector gets interested.
Okay.
And those private sector are the ones that will sustain any project, and especially those that we're looking to deal with on infrastructure.
Okay.
And when I talked about preparation, I wanted to bring in this so that we don't go away from it when you talked about the private sector. What I talked about preparation is ensuring that the continent, let's not get into the conversation of whether we need to adapt or mitigate or do this, we need to do all. But I'm trying to say that if you haven't built a rail line, why do you want to build one that it's not climate resilient?
Doesn't make sense.
Doesn't. So if you're going to do something new that doesn't exist, I have a lot of countries, especially across the globe, trying to ensure that the things they did wrong are reversed. We haven't done a lot yet.
Okay.
So why are we not looking to ensure that these things that we're building and what we're talking about, for instance, in Kenya, there was a $100 million wind farm already standing there. And it's done right. It's answers to the sustainability that you talk about. So I don't want us to step away from doing the things that are right because, we don't want to get into the, let's not categorize. Let's focus on, one, return on investment, impact on the continent, ensuring that the globally accepted ESG principles are married into the projects that we're doing. And what I can say for now, and from experience in the past 4 years of the Africa Investment Forum, is that it's doable.
Sure, it's doable. And I'll say it's not even us who are really distinguishing that. It is the institutions that we do have. Like, for instance, Green Climate Fund has a clear distinction between what is adaptation financing and what is mitigation. So we do have those institutions that say, if you are accessing adaptation fund, these are the criteria. If it is about the green mitigation, these are the criteria. And perhaps there are questions to be asked about the processes and even the question of not distinguishing them. It's very clear to the policymakers. Most of them, when you look at the policies in Kenya, for instance, they categorically say that there is no need for distinguishing between what is mitigation and what is development. To them, it's just the same thing. And I want to go back to you, Richard.
Before you say that, before you move away from that distinguishing, in terms of accessing the finance, and that distinguishing must be present. But in terms of deploying them, you don't take away one or the other. You could bring both on the table.
Absolutely.
That's the point I'm making. So it's not either or blurring the lines of what side entails. It's pulling them both together in a singular project.
No, I think that exists. That exists a lot on the ground. I mean, people don't want to know whether this water project has been developed as a result of mitigation or adaptation. They just want water. So that is there, even inherent. It is inherent in the needs. It is in the details, in accessing those funds to meet those needs that I think a lot of problems there are. I don't know whether it's the capacity or I don't know where we are. But I will go back to Richard before we, I'm being told that we have a few more minutes left. Before we go back and ask you for your concluding thoughts around all these questions, I will ask you something very important, and I hope that it doesn't put you on the spot because you are in the UN Environment Program. But the last few years, and even this came up in the COP27, that there has been a lot of declining trust in the multilateral system, partly because of what you mentioned earlier, unkept promises. 100 billion many years ago, I think 13 years ago, was promised, but up to now, very little has come into that. You have also highlighted the issue of the LDF and the tiny bit that has come into the fund through the pledges. I will not ask you about what we need to do with the funding processes and so on and so forth. I will ask you, what do you think needs to be done to restore this declining trust for the multilateral system to make it work, particularly for Africa and Africa's young people?
Yeah, thanks again, Martin, and thanks to Tobi and Chinelo. I think, let me put this in perspective before I come to your question, because the reality is that if multilateral processes were not working, we wouldn't have had Paris Climate Change Agreement, where all countries, as compared to the Kyoto Protocol today, have their climate change plans, the nationally determined contribution, as they call it, and they've ratified it. That means that multilateral system works. If there was no multilateralism working, then there wouldn't be talk of the loss and damage fund decision that was adopted during COP27. The process is slow, which is understandable. Over 200 countries coming together to make decisions, taking into consideration national priorities and national circumstances is something that is not just a walk in the park. That's understood. Let me bring this back to the reality of the continent. The African Union launched the Africa Climate Change Strategy last year. That's progress. Each and every country have ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and they have actually put in place Climate Change Act. Kenya in 2016 put in place Climate Change Act. 2021, Uganda put in place Climate Change Act, and a host of African countries. There is progress. And let me say this, I think the narrative is actually what dissuades sometimes not to leverage this progress, but instead focus on where there are pitfalls. If you do not communicate progress, you will dissuade citizens and you will not be able to make progress. Progress can be able to foster progress. And unless we change the narrative to build on what works to close the gaps, we will continuously see only the gap, a glass half filled, sometimes not really coming to the middle. And the other point I want to touch before I come to an end is something that Chinelo mentioned. And I think it's a narrative that is not been, it's not taken over. I like the way you put it. The truth is this: when you look at funds in the continent, especially access to these funds are not being tapped. You look at sovereign bonds, you look at pension funds, they constitute 1.8 trillion US dollars, and these are state-owned funds. Only 10% of that will be about 180 billion US dollars in the continent that can fund adaptation between now and 2030. Government can leverage this and create what we call de-risking instruments and de-risk microfinance and banks so that at least they can be able to lend to this informal sector. And I think what Chinelo is saying there is very, very important, because it comes to the aspect of how Africa can leverage financing internally and then use the structures that are accessible. And therefore, the key point we must focus on is not just access to finance. It's also, do we have the right skills? If you throw 1 trillion on people who do not have the skills to be able to manufacture a solar dryer, fabricate a solar dryer, or turn agricultural waste into fuel briquettes, into a biogas, will the money itself work? And therefore, the young people retooling their skill is the biggest investment, because a skilled person is more valuable than money. Economics tells us that natural capital, a skilled person is 14 times more than natural capital and 4 times more than produced capital. If we do not focus on investing in our young people, even if we have all the funds in the world, we will not be able to build climate resilience. And lastly, we focus sometimes in looking at feasibility from returns on investment. That's fine, excellent. Social viability, returns on investment. How about the attitudes? We need to start doing feasibility of attitudes. In the continent today, like you said, Martin, the discussion is about adaptation mitigation. It's about assessing funds. It's always about assessing funds, but it's not about looking at what is already working in the continent to leverage on it. My mother in the village today, and I just came back from Uganda this morning, where I went to a village called Nakaseke in central Uganda. It is actually in the corridor where climate change impacts are visible. And I met a group of mothers who are leveraging on the work we do, and they have access to a solar dryer that they've actually increased their incomes by 30% compared to when they were drying their vegetables on the ground. That they said that during inflation, which they are still facing today, they have more money to be able to afford not only flour, corn flour or wheat, but at the same time can be able to send their kids to school. That's what local communities need. Food on the table and more money in more pockets. But that needs us to ensure that we can have the youth that can fabricate a solar dryer, to ensure we can have the youth that can turn agricultural waste into fuel briquettes, that can turn that into biogas to replace charcoal and kerosene. Until we start to see this from this dimension and know that money is just part of a means, it's not an end. We need people to be able to take the solutions forward. Then we will only be dealing with one part of the equation, and at the end of the day, we'll come back to discuss the same.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And now I think after that I think what I would describe as a vibrant discussion, do we have a few more minutes for questions from the audience? Right. Yes, we do have. Okay, so I don't know how to do this. Maybe we'll start from behind, coming back. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Hope. I just have a quick question precisely for Chinelo. She mentioned the AIF, and I worked with social innovators in Africa for like the past 3 years, and I know that there are lots of them that their enterprises are not for profit. And one of the criteria you've mentioned is that it should be profit-oriented. So when I think of climate change, I think of people, I think of the planet, and I think of profit. But these people, they are doing it because Africa needs it. Are there opportunities within this fund for social entrepreneurs that are doing things, especially young people across the continent, that can leverage this same fund that you're talking about, even if they are not, profit-oriented?
Thank you. That's a question about opportunities for social enterprises. And then come on to us my far left, and then far right. Or perhaps I start, where's the microphone nearest? All right, go on ahead, sorry, and then we'll.
Oh, and you can also use the mics in front of you. Just press and hold on the speaker. If the red light comes on, you can
My
use
name
that.
is Tarhas. I have been participating in the climate negotiation, COP. I don't know for how many years, since 2004. And I know that Africa has progressed so far, especially to do with the African negotiators. We have done slowly, but at least we are making some progress. But to answer the question of your team, should Africa be optimistic about COP27? For example, personally, I was in COP27 and I was engaged in a program called Coronovia. And this was a program that had been implemented in Poland. And whoever the financiers had been trying to kill it, it took the whole 2 weeks to revive it. And only just at the last minute, with the help of the Egyptians. I think the Egyptians for COP27 have to be given credit. Otherwise, there would not have been that little success we had for loss and damage. And now what I'm saying is we should not really be that optimistic, because what Africa needs is not this kind of negotiation, because it's too slow to achieve anything. And it's deliberately made slow for us not to achieve it. And what shall we do for it not to be so slow? For example, in Durban, the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi had implemented about climate finance. If this program has succeeded, we would not have this problem for adaptation or whatever. So could Africa Development Bank revive that program as we now revive the Coronovia? Coronovia, for somebody who would not know, it's about agriculture, to make agriculture part of the climate change negotiation.
Yes, thank you.
We want that climate finance that was introduced by Meles Zenawi to solve our adaptation problem.
Thank you. I think we've got the point. The point you're talking about, the Coronovia project or initiative, which is on agriculture and stuff, and you've expressed yourself about the optimism that we should have. There was one hand on my far left. Yes, please go ahead, and then I think we'll take those for now, and then we'll can have another round.
Hello, I'm Lois, and mine is a quick one to focus on should Africa be optimistic about COP27. I'm a firm believer that with climate change, and I'm that person who's interested in climate change in Africa. I believe if we look at Africa, let's go to the villages. They've been very net zero. They use sand to dry their crops. They use mud to make their houses. However, if you look at where investments are, especially international multinationals, let's see where oil is, example in Kenya, Turkana, and let's say where they invest in cocoa and the mining places, you find they've left it in such a place where now the climate change is affecting us. Is there a way, or let's say the UNEP or COP27, have they held these countries and these multinationals accountable and reparations to the countries that have suffered as a result of the exploitation in African land?
Okay, yeah, I'm told this side. Oh, yes, here. We need a mic here, because I think this is a very big row, so we'll have to from that end. Here, a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious around the question of the resources that are required for renewables and for battery-powered vehicles and so forth, solar panels. These resources like cobalt, lithium, they obviously have to be extracted from African countries. And it's no secret that the mining conditions to extract these resources are not looking that good, and it's releasing lots of toxic fumes, and babies are being born with defects as a result. My question is, to what extent are these experiences being taken into consideration in the whole discussion around renewables?
Okay. I don't know whether we'll be able. So, Can we agree we respond to those, and then if we do have a bit of time, we can do another round, yeah? We agree on that? Yes, thank you. So we do have questions. I don't know who wants to go first, but we have a question on the opportunities for social enterprises. Slow progress, whether we should do something about it to ensure that it is quick, so that Africa's young population does not age before we get to decisions that are important. And then is there a way to hold multinationals accountable, and especially the question on resource extraction and the impact of that. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first, because the lady was a direct question. Our focus, yes, is on return on investment, but it doesn't preclude social things as well. And there are different sources for that. If you wanted funding for the very laudable work of technology innovation, and it would be from a different source who is not expecting. We have grants available. We have, and even a place like the Africa Investment Forum has both funding from DFIs, international institutions as well, who are prepared to give grants to this kind of endeavors you talk about. So yes, they exist, but again, the focus is on return on investment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chinelo, for that quick. Who wants to go next on the other questions? Tobi? All right, go on ahead.
What question would you like me to answer?
Whichever you are most comfortable. Yeah, there was a question on slow progress. It shouldn't be, it's too slow. The multilateral system is too slow. And then there was a question of whether these multinational companies can be held accountable.
I will try to answer that.
Okay.
I'm not really a politics expert, but I am a firm believer in the autonomy, really, of each country and the ability for each country to enforce its own laws. I believe that as countries and as a continent with Africa, we don't need to rely on the international community to try to hold multinationals into account. A lot of these multinationals, even though they exist, their headquarters are in a lot of these Western or developed countries. I think it is important and incumbent on the government within those countries to try to hold them into account, develop those policies, and then enforce them.
Okay.
Making sure that these multinationals do not just come in, extract, take advantage of the communities, and then just leave without any repercussions. In a lot of instances, you find that these multinationals they happen to manage to bribe or try to, I would say, foster corruption, essentially within the government. And it's important to try to own the responsibility of holding these multinationals into account within each country and not.
And just very quickly, just to add to Toby, the question you asked is also not an entirely African problem. It's a global issue in terms of exploitation and non-responsible extraction and manufacturing. The key thing is what Toby mentioned, repercussions.
Yeah, so I think you're going back to the leadership and the institutions that are supposed to safeguard these resources and the people. So if we are seeing all these things happen, I am still not convinced that those institutions are working. But Dr. Richard, somebody who has participated in the COPs since 2004, that is almost 20 years, have said it is too slow, the multilateral system is too slow, it shouldn't be, and therefore perhaps we should have cautious optimism. What do you say?
The reality is this: the multilateral process has produced what it needs to produce. Is it enough? No. Adaptation and mitigation actions occur at the national level. And at the national level, they occur at the local level. Adaptation is local. Climate action solutions are local. What is stopping citizens of the country, especially the young people, to be able to leverage the already existing policies? If you take Kenya, for example, in the 2021 Finance Act, there were VAT exemptions on clean fuels, briquettes, bagasse. How many you tap into it to be able to turn that, and across other countries in the continent today? This is the point I want to make here, and I think to the audience to really get this. The reality is that there's no absence of policy at the national level. It's implementation, and implementation is not by government alone. The citizens are implementers and need to hold government to be able to close the gaps, especially finance gap and enabling policies that can be able to then create the enabling environment. What needs to happen today is when we say multilateral process has been slow and countries in the African continent have revised their nationally determined contributions, putting climate action focus on clean energy and also sustainable agriculture, where did the multilateral process says that citizens should not tap into turning agricultural waste into biofertilizer, which they can tap into $1 trillion industry? Where did the multilateral process says that citizens should stop turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes to replace charcoal and tap into a $20 billion industry in the continent? I go back to that one word I use, narrative. And unless we start to debug these narratives, we might actually be infringing into an arena that will continuously engulf people not to see opportunities in challenges. Climate change is a disguised opportunity, and anytime we see it through that lens, we will be doing a service to the continent of Africa.
Very nice, very nice. I will take that, Richard, that climate change is an opportunity disguised as a job or as a very difficult task. So I think maybe 1 minute to say whether we should be optimistic about COP27. 1 minute for each panelist. I'm told there are only 5 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm not be able to take another. It's now 3. So 1 for you each. So we'll start with Dr. Tobi on that end.
Yes, just to answer that quickly, yes, we should be optimistic. I think given the point that we're starting, we have so much opportunity that we can use to basically take ourselves from where we are to where we need to be from a climate change perspective. Right. From development of technology to just proliferation of information, there's so much that we can do in order to educate and then take ourselves to where we need to be. And so, yeah, I would say we should be optimistic.
Yeah, so we should be optimistic. That's a 1 out of 3. Chinelo?
Well, I actually concur. We do need to be optimistic. And we also need to laud initiatives, no matter how slow they might be in implementation. What we should be thinking about is not to discredit the initiatives, but how to jumpstart it and remove the things that don't work with the continent. And that means that we have to be, more than anybody else, continuously optimistic and also continuously ready to work to realize the optimism that we share. And the continent is huge with more opportunities. And back to the lady who talked about the resources needing to power this sustainable future. The bulk of it is in the continent. Now we need to wake up and ensure that we have the processes that ensure that the utilization of it don't rape the continent. That's our responsibility, nobody else's.
Fantastic. We have to be optimistic. That's 2 out of 3. Dr. Richard, what say you?
We have to be optimistic, and we are actually living at the right time because Africa's adversity represents opportunities and challenges. And the NDCs that have actually been put in place by countries represent $1 trillion opportunity for each and everyone to tap into. But to do that, we need a learning revolution where we move from communicating challenges and start communicating opportunities, where we move away from discussing how we don't have money to start looking how we can tap into those resources using the accessible financial institutions that are closer to us. And lastly, we must become inspired with the challenges and play our role, because without us playing our role and always blaming government and others, we might never be able to make progress.
Fantastic. That is 3 out of 3, ladies and gentlemen, that we should be optimistic. We should be optimistic as a continent. 1, because we have the people. 2, because we can access those resources. 3, because we do have the resources that are needed for the future. 4, because we are bright and we have the future. We have very, very, very high stakes in the future, so we can't afford not to be optimistic. And number 5, we do have systems that exist where we can start making things work. Even if they are still slow or whatever they are, we can still work using those institutions to make them work for us. I think we have done quite all right now. Can you give these lovely panelists a round of applause? Thank you. Thank you so much. The discussion doesn't stop here. As you can tell, it's quite a lot to talk about. Sorry for those that are here that didn't get their questions fielded, but we are not just evaporating from here. You can ask those questions when we are around here and they will be answered. Thank you so much, and back to Agatha. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to our chair for such an invigorating debate.